Hello and welcome back to the Electronic Intifada's live stream for Thursday, October 16th. Thank you for tuning in. I'm Nora Barrows-Friedman with my colleagues Ali Abonima, Jon Elmer, Asa Winstanley, and Tamara Nassar. It's day 741 of Israel's genocide in Gaza. Coming up, we'll be joined by Helena Cobban, a writer with decades of knowledge about the region and the director of Just World Educational, to talk about the factors that might seal the fate of this ceasefire agreement that Israel is already sabotaging and what may come next. Later on in the program, Jon will cover the third prisoner exchange since October 2023 and give a short history of prisoner exchanges in the Palestinian national movement. But first, let's take a look at the news. Here's a brief summary of some of the latest developments this week in Palestine. On October 10th, the U.S. brokered third ceasefire came into effect following 2 years and 3 days of Israel's genocide in Gaza. Journalist Ayman al-Hissi documented thousands of Palestinians once again returning to their homes in Gaza City and the north, many of whom were forcibly displaced by Israel over the last few weeks. Mahmoud Bassal, spokesperson for the civil defense, was greeted by reporter Saeed Hezbollah and passers-by in the early hours of the announcement of a truce on October 9th, as Palestinians expected the bombing to stop. Bassal said, smiling broadly, quote, "This is the moment we've been waiting for 2 years, 2 years of our people being exterminated, 2 years of our people being murdered. Today, Gaza is liberated from this occupation. Today, a ceasefire is declared. Congratulations to our people. Congratulations to every child in Gaza." An older man tells Saeed, quote, "We congratulate you on your steadfastness and the steadfastness of the Palestinian people on this beloved land." Another man adds, quote, "Gaza has proven throughout the ages that it is resistant to aggression. Gaza is the symbol of legendary patience. We stayed in Gaza. We will not leave Gaza and will not allow any occupier or colonizer to kill this country."
إعلان وقف إطلاق النار في مدينة غزة الآن يدخل حيز التنفيذ. هذه اللحظة التي كنا ننتظرها من عامين وشعبنا يباد، عامين وشعبنا يقتل، واليوم غزة تتحرر من هذا الاحتلال. اليوم يعلن وقف إطلاق النار. هنيئا لشعبنا، هنيئا لكل طفل في غزة.
نهنئ صمودكم، نهنئ صمودكم، نهنئ صمودكم وصمود الشعب الفلسطيني على هذا التراب الحبيب.
غزة أثبتت عبر العصور إنها عاصية على العدوان. غزة أيقونة الصبر الأسطوري. إحنا بقينا في غزة، ولن نهاجر غزة، ولن نسمح لأي محتل أو مستعمر أن يقتل هذا البلد.
However, later that night on October 9th, just hours after people celebrated and tried to return home, Israeli forces bombed a building in the center of Gaza City, killing at least 6 and wounding many others, with more trapped under the rubble. Saad Hezbollah again reported from the scene, showing civil defense crews trying to reach the dead and wounded. The spokesperson for the Gaza municipality, our contributor Asim al-Nabih, spoke to Middle East Eye on October 9th as the Israeli army was still attacking areas across Gaza.
Tell us how news of the ceasefire has been received in Gaza today.
To be honest, there is no ceasefire yet in the city. In the past 20 minutes, there were more than 5 explosions. That's I counted myself. Why I'm sure there is other explosions in another neighborhoods. We can't say that there is a calmness in the city, while many people around the world circulating the news about ceasefire. The people in Gaza are still suffering from different and difficult circumstances in terms of bombardment, in terms of food insecurity, in terms of water scarcity, in terms of massive destruction in the infrastructure and civic facilities. Today, after 2 years of genocidal war in Gaza, there is a water scarcity. Can you imagine that there is more than 75% of the total water wells in Gaza have been destroyed, and people now are getting less than 25% of the total daily needs of water.
On October 10th, as the ceasefire was finally implemented, Palestinians continued to return to the north. Journalist Abdelkader Sabah filmed this footage for Dropsite News, saying, quote, "People are returning to Gaza City any way they can, on foot, by motorized rickshaw, by truck, but the level of destruction is difficult to explain. Sheikh Radwan is destroyed, so is Tal al-Hawa, Nafaq Street. Many neighborhoods are ruined, but some features of life are returning." Journalist Bisan Auda documented the wreckage Israel left behind in the ruins of the Zaytun neighborhood of Gaza City on October 11th.
This is Bisan from Gaza. Today I'm documenting a new neighborhood that was destroyed in the past 2 to 3 weeks, and it's around the Zaytun neighborhood in Gaza City. And this is the explosive vehicle, or what the Palestinians call explosive robot. It's booby-trapped also. This is a vehicle that the Israelis used to put about 10 to 15 times a day during the past 2 months. These used to be vehicles to carry the soldiers, by the way, as you see. But during the genocide, the Israelis used it to put explosive material inside, and then to put them in the middle of the neighborhoods. As you see, nothing is standing until about 200 meters, and then after that, the damage starts. But all of these homes were shaken.
Bisan Auda. Over the weekend, as they had agreed to do under the ceasefire terms, Palestinian resistance factions handed over all living Israeli captives to the International Committee of the Red Cross and began locating and preparing to transfer the bodies of dead Israeli captives as well. Israel began releasing living Palestinian hostages from Israeli prisons and detention camps who returned to Gaza in severe health crises, testifying to unbearable torture, sexual assault, and sadistic humiliation at the hands of Israeli guards. Photojournalist Shadi Abu Sido, who was kidnapped on March 18, 2024, during the Israeli occupation's raid on Al-Shifa Hospital in Gaza City, spoke about his 20 months of Israeli torture. He says, quote, "For 2 years I was starved. I went in starving and came out starving. They hung our bodies day and night, naked, abused and insulted us. They told us, 'We killed your children. Gaza is gone.'" Another freed hostage, 28-year-old Mahmoud Abu Ful, said he was brutally beaten and tortured after being abducted from Kamal Adwan Hospital in December 2024. Abu Ful says that Israeli forces beat him so severely in the head during interrogations that he lost his ability to see. During the siege on Kamal Adwan Hospital on December 27, 2024, the Israeli army kidnapped everyone inside, including Abu Ful and, of course, the hospital's director, Dr. Hussam Abu Safiya, who remains in detention despite indications earlier this week that he would be freed under the ceasefire terms. Earlier today, on Thursday, an Israeli court rubber-stamped the extension of Dr. Abu Safiya's arbitrary detention for 6 more months, according to Al-Mizan Center for Human Rights. No charges or evidence have been presented against him, making his detention illegal and politically motivated. Al-Mizan added that, quote, "This decision strips away any pretense. Dr. Abu Safiya is a hostage, a bargaining chip in ongoing negotiations." Over the past few days, Israeli forces also transferred dozens of dead bodies it had been holding to Gaza without any identifying information. Palestinian medical sources said that all 45 of the Palestinian bodies handed over by Israeli forces on Tuesday were blindfolded and handcuffed, indicating that field executions may have taken place. Reporter Adli Abu Taha captured footage of bodies being returned to Gaza on Wednesday. In addition, track marks were found on some of the bodies, suggesting that they may have been run over by Israeli tanks. Israel had complained that not all of the bodies of its dead captives had been handed over on Tuesday, and announced that it had begun a policy of collective punishment by restricting the amount of humanitarian aid it would allow into Gaza and refusing to open the Rafah crossing at the Egyptian border. Palestinian political officials had long emphasized that it would take time and heavy machinery to locate the bodies, since Israel has completely destroyed the areas where bodies had been buried and has still refused to allow in any vehicles to remove the rubble. On Wednesday, the Qassam Brigades, the armed wing of Hamas, issued a statement saying that the group has met its commitments under the plan as it pertains to Israeli captives in Gaza. Quote, the resistance has adhered to what was agreed upon and has handed over all the living prisoners it can and the bodies it can access, the statement read. As for the remaining bodies, they require significant efforts and special equipment to search for and retrieve them, and we are making great efforts to close this file, they said. Jon will have much more on the prisoner exchanges later on in the program. Israel's attacks on Palestinians have not stopped. On Tuesday, October 14th, Israel killed at least 9 Palestinians, including 5 in the Shujaia neighborhood of eastern Gaza City. Palestinians were injured by Israeli fire in Jabalia, also in northern Gaza, on Tuesday, according to Gaza Emergency Services. Israeli army attacks in Khan Yunis killed at least 1 Palestinian and injured another, and medical sources stated that 3 Palestinians were killed on Wednesday, including 2 who were killed in another attack on Shujaia. 4 Palestinians were killed on Thursday, according to the health ministry in Gaza, bringing the total number of people killed by Israel since the ceasefire began to at least 23. Meanwhile, you'll remember that last week we brought you several separate clips showing the 27-year-old journalist Saleh Al-Jafarawi celebrating the truce, walking through the streets late at night announcing the ceasefire to residents who didn't receive the news yet, and coming home to his beloved cat. He uploaded this clip on October 9th, surrounded by his colleagues and vowing to continue the coverage even if the genocide continues. On Sunday, October 12th, Saleh was killed, reportedly by armed gangs who have been collaborating with Israel in Gaza City, as he was documenting the first days of the ceasefire and the extent of destruction that Israeli forces left behind. He had been hunted by Israel during the last 2 years of the genocide and had buried many friends and colleagues who were murdered in assassinations by the Israeli army. Saleh's his brother, Naji, was released from detention in Israel just hours after Saleh was buried by his relatives and loved ones. Naji told reporters that he was tortured and beaten and comforted Saleh's mourning friends, including reporter Ahmed Kahil. Naji tells Ahmed, quote, "You are all our brothers after Saleh. May we be able to fill his shoes for you. Saleh has fulfilled what he has presented."
أنا ذاكر إنه كحيل هيك أنا شكل سبحان الله ذكرني في الله يرحمه شو بحيل والله كلكم إخوانه وإنتوا إخواننا بعد صالح وربنا إن شاء الله يعيننا وهيك إن شاء الله نوفي مكانة صالح عندكم استعينوا بالله وشدوا حيلكم صالح أفضل إلى ما قدر.
Saleh Al-Jafarawi was not only a dedicated journalist, he was also a talented singer. Last year, he sang a song called "Where Are You, O Humanity?" along with his friends and colleagues. It was recorded by journalist and poet Muhammad Al-Sha'ir.
من عز جرحك وارفعي شارة نصر رح ترجعي بذنوبنا عمراني أبي يا غزة اسمعي يا عالي ما تخضعي إلا لربك تركعي معنا ولا ينسانا.
Exactly 2 years to the day before his murder, Saleh al-Jafarawi, in a viral clip on social media, was filmed comforting an infant in the first week of Israel's genocide on October 12th, 2023. According to the Gaza government media office, Saleh was the 255th reporter and media worker to be killed in Gaza since October 2023. As of Wednesday, the Israeli army was continuing to restrict the amount of humanitarian aid, including food and basic supplies, into Gaza, in another clear violation of the terms of the ceasefire agreement. Al Jazeera's Tarek Abu Azoum said that only a trickle of aid is reaching Gaza, including only 12 World Food Program trucks that entered the central areas. Under the agreement, at least 600 trucks daily are mandated to enter. Euromed Human Rights Monitor stated on Tuesday that, quote, the risk of famine and malnutrition and their devastating consequences remains present in the Gaza Strip despite the entry into force of the ceasefire agreement. The limited quantities of goods and aid allowed into Gaza represent only a fraction of actual needs and fall far short of addressing the severe food and supply deficit that Israel has deliberately imposed as a tool of genocide during 2 years of military assault and comprehensive blockade. The rights group added that its field monitors reported that Israel permitted the entry of only 173 aid trucks since the ceasefire began on October 10th, with limited quantities of fuel and cooking gas, food, supplies, and some medical items. No aid trucks were allowed to enter on Monday under the pretext of releasing Palestinian detainees, nor on Tuesday due to Jewish holidays, both in blatant violation of the ceasefire agreement, Euromed said. Quote, Israel's control over the volume of aid, its non-compliance with the ceasefire terms, and its move toward further reductions not only constitute a breach of the agreement, but also amount to the continuation of genocide by depriving civilians of their basic rights, chief among them food, water, and medicine, and by imposing life-threatening conditions. This ongoing policy demonstrates Israel's determination to use starvation as a central instrument in its strategy to destroy Palestinian society in Gaza. The rights group noted that the entry of humanitarian aid into Gaza, quote, is not a privilege granted by Israel, but a binding legal obligation under international humanitarian law, guaranteeing civilians in wartime an absolute right to receive such assistance, and that, quote, any attempt to link food or medicine to political or security conditions constitutes a flagrant violation of fundamental rights, including the right to life, dignity, personal safety, health, food, and water. Meanwhile, the sites used by the joint U.S.-Israeli private killing fields masquerading as the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation were dismantled this week. Tarek Abu Azoum reported from one of the sites near the Netzarim corridor on October 11th.
Behind me, you can see a barren landscape, which is quite empty at the moment. It used to be the main aid center run by the controversial Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. It's located very close, as you can see, to Netzarim corridor, and this aid hub has been meant to provide aid services for at least 300,000 Palestinians. We can see now the landscape has quite changed under the current terms of the ceasefire agreement. The foundation itself has dismantled the site here in order to completely deliver the responsibility of delivering aid supplies to the United Nations and its affiliated agencies. And once we were touring here, we found the remnants of the Israeli military munition that used to attack Palestinians who were seeking aid in the site. We can see right now the remnants of sound grenades and few bullets that have been used to shoot people who were trying to reach the site to getting aid. And if you can see there, at the other end, people are still moving throughout Salahuddin Road. This area was
marked as an active red zone, and people were forced to cross long distance on foot in order to get their hands on food supplies, especially during the famine spreading period. The way has been very rocky, it's very complicated to get here, and for many Palestinians, they have described these sites to be completely death traps. And according to initial medical reports, we are talking about over 2,600 Palestinians have been killed near the controversial Gaza Humanitarian Foundation 8 centers, and over 19,000 others were wounded. This mechanism has been really triggering huge level of criticism among international humanitarian actors, describing it to be very humiliating. And for now, there is a huge shift in the policy of delivering aid supplies, as the United Nations will be responsible in cooperation with the International Committee of the Red Cross to deliver much needed humanitarian supplies during the first phase of the ceasefire deal.
Was Tarek Abu Azoum reporting from central Gaza. We've published many features on the Electronic Intifada in the last week, but we wanted to highlight what I saw from the open hatch of an aid plane over Gaza by an anonymous writer. At 1,000 meters above Gaza, the hatch of a Jordanian aid plane swings open, and I get a glimpse of the blue Mediterranean. The shoreline summons images of 1948, when Palestinian families from Haifa and Jaffa were forced to flee to Gaza to escape Zionist militias who were ethnically cleansing Palestine's coastal villages. The images fade quickly from my mind, and they are replaced by today's shoreline. 77 years on, it is again crowded with displaced families and tents. The view of Gaza itself from above is a shock, a disfigured cityscape, where entire neighborhoods have been wiped off the map and others have been reduced to a monotonous gray by Israel's relentless bombardment. Markets barely function, their pale colors set against the rubble, as people walk through ruins or pull carts through broken streets. With every district the plane passes over, the devastation deepens, a relentless panorama of destruction stretching for more than 10 minutes of flight. Weeks earlier, I had been assigned by a news outlet to document these so-called humanitarian operations. I wrestled with the dilemma. Should I record a scene I knew to be contrived, or try to show something different? I consulted colleagues, and some urged me to go, suggesting this might be a rare chance to capture what is usually hidden behind the heroic and staged pictures that often emerge from such operations. The trip began at the King Abdullah II Air Base in Zarqa, Jordan, where military aircraft from European countries and, of course, Jordan, are stationed along a lengthy runway. Yet it's the media presence, not the aircraft, that dominates the scene. Dozens of journalists and correspondents compete for interviews and images of the troops as they load aid packages. Every photograph will serve a pivotal purpose: to polish the images of the states involved in the airdrops and to legitimize the aid operation itself. As the plane prepared for takeoff, a question troubled me. How will we prove 30 years from now, in the pages of history, that these images were never about aid? The very states that now posture in sympathy to Palestinians, appearing to send relief, are the same ones that have armed Israel politically and militarily. They have granted Israel cover to wage a war of annihilation on Gaza. Today's airdrops are attempts to cleanse blood-stained hands, yet they ignore calls from Palestinians in Gaza themselves to end this theater. As the photographers and journalists boarded the plane, we were instructed by military personnel not to film Gaza or its devastation. On the flight I joined, filming was restricted to the boxes of supplies and the soldiers. On board, the handful of journalists were monitored by military media officers who combed through images to ensure lenses did not point toward Gaza's annihilation, but remained fixed on the spectacle of aid. Once again, the Palestinian voice was erased mid-flight. And of course, most journalists and outlets don't care. So long as the footage is exclusive and can be sold, nothing else matters. The aid drop journey took nearly 2 hours round trip. Once the aircraft door was shut, with all the packages dropped onto Gaza, the atmosphere inside grew quiet and cameras stopped recording. Through the window, the coastline came back into view. The soldiers began to look like actors on a break between takes, stretched out on the floor, waiting for the plane to return to the military airport. If the ceasefire holds, airdrops may become outmoded as a form of whitewashing for governments complicit in the genocide. But those same countries will still pose as Gaza's saviors, promising aid that will come with many colonial strings attached. Back in Amman, as I headed back into the city, I saw the banners for the Jordan International Food Festival, hosted by the Jordanian government, while Gaza starves. Those are excerpts from What I Saw from the Open Hatch of an Aid Plane Over Gaza by an anonymous writer on electronicintifada.net. And now, as we always do, we wanted to highlight people expressing joy, determination, and resilience across Gaza and around the world. In Gaza, a freed Palestinian hostage is carried on the shoulders of his community, still in Israeli prison garb, but singing and dancing. This clip was filmed by reporter Rami Salim. And finally, music teacher Ahmed Mouin Abu Amsha and his colleagues performed a song by the legendary Lebanese artist Marcel Khalifa called The Child and the Plane. He said this performance of the song was inspired by Manal Awad, the director of the Edward Said National Conservatory of Music's Gaza branch. The song, Abu Amsha writes, is about a little boy who searches for strings to fly his kite, a symbol of joy, innocence, and freedom. But the sky betrayed his dream. The plane he saw was larger than life and heavier than his tiny heart. It came not with peace, but with destruction. We sing The Child and the Plane by Marcel Khalifa with the displaced children in Gaza's camps to remind the world that childhood deserves peace.
1, 2, 3, 4.
And that's it for the news roundup. As always, go to electronicintifada.net for much more, especially to read our new features by our brave writers in Gaza. You're watching the Electronic Intifada live stream. I'm Nora Barrows-Friedman with my colleague Ali Abunimah. Hi, Ali.
Hi, Nora. Thank you for that report.
Yeah.
It's just a reminder that despite the headlines, which we're going to be talking a lot about today and all the peace fanfare, this hasn't ended even slightly for people in Gaza. I mean, yes, there is not the night and day bombing, the daily massacres of 100 and 150 people. That has ended, thank God, and hopefully it won't return. But the scale of the suffering is immense and ongoing.
Yeah. And Israel just gets to enact collective punishments. You know, we were talking last week with Jeremy Scahill about how big of a gamble the Palestinian political leadership and the resistance factions were taking by agreeing to release all of the Israeli captives at once and trusting that that Israel and the international actors would keep their agreements. And of course, what we're seeing now is that Israel wasted no time in starting the sabotage of all the agreements that it had agreed upon. So we're going to be talking to Helena about that coming up. And of course, Jon later on in the program has a very deep dive history on these kinds of prisoner exchanges and the sabotaging of ceasefires and agreements over the years. But yeah.
Yeah, and we'll also talk more later on about Trump's speech and some of the things we can glean from that during his visit to the region last week. But let's bring our next guest on because we have a lot to get through. So I'll just remind everyone, you are watching and listening to the Electronic Intifada live stream. I'm Ali Abou-Neama, here with my colleague Nora Barrows-Friedman. On Monday, US President Donald Trump traveled to Jerusalem and then to Egypt to celebrate the signing of a ceasefire and prisoner exchange agreement for Gaza, which he claims is the beginning of everlasting peace in the Middle East. The spectacle included that speech in the Knesset, Israel's parliament, followed by a summit in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, where Trump humiliated some of the gathered leaders from Europe, Turkey, Pakistan, Indonesia, and various US-backed Arab regimes. Here's a short clip of Trump apparently not shaking hands with the host, Egyptian ruler Abdel Fattah al-Sisi.
Put it out before it starts. Thank you.
And here he is greeting senior Emirati official Sheikh Mansour. A lot of cash, as Donald Trump says. Also present was former British Prime Minister Tony Blair, who is mentioned in Trump's so-called peace plan as effectively a new British colonial governor over Gaza, or at least that's the ambition. Noticeably absent was Israel, whose Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is refusing to endorse Trump's assertion that the war in Gaza is over. Also skipping the meeting were Iran and other major powers, including Russia and China. The gathering in Egypt was limited to the United States and its vassals. Meanwhile, over the last few days, Hamas has, as agreed, released all 20 living Israeli prisoners of war in Gaza and is in the process of returning others who died in Gaza, almost certainly as a result of Israeli bombing. Israel has released some 2,000 Palestinians from its prisons, many brutally abused and tortured, but is violating and sabotaging the ceasefire agreement by continuing to kill Palestinians in Gaza and restricting aid from entering. At least 3 Palestinians were killed today, according to health authorities in Gaza, and at least a dozen more over the last few days since the ceasefire began. Joining us to talk about the latest developments and what might come next is Helena Cobban. She is a writer with decades of experience and knowledge about the region, and she directs Just World Educational. Her latest article for the newsletter Globalities is titled The Status and Meaning of Trump's Gaza ceasefire deal, and we'll talk about that now. Welcome, Helena, back to the Electronic Intifada live stream.
Oh, it's always good to be with you and the amazing team that you lead there, Ali.
Hi, Helena.
Thank you. So, Helena, during his speech in the Knesset on Monday, Donald Trump congratulated Israel on victory. Let's take a look at a clip of him speaking in the Knesset.
So this long and difficult war has now ended. You know, some people say 3,000 years, some people say 500 years, whatever it is. It's the granddaddy of them all. And in an unprecedented achievement, virtually the entire region has endorsed the plan that Gaza will be immediately demilitarized, that Hamas will be disarmed, and Israel's security will no longer be threatened in any way, shape, or form. So Israel, with our help, has won all that they can by force of arms. You've won. I mean, you've won. Now it's time to translate these victories against terrorists on the battlefield into the ultimate prize of peace and prosperity for the entire Middle East. It's about time you...
All over the place. Oh, you're muted, Ali.
So you heard Trump declaring victory there, Helena. What's your understanding of the October 10th agreement leading to the ceasefire, and what has actually been agreed? What did Israel gain, and what did the people of Gaza and the resistance gain or give up in the agreement?
First of all, some people are calling this the October 9th agreement, some the October 10th agreement. It was agreed on the 9th, but didn't go into operation until the 10th, when the Security Cabinet of Israel adopted it. So I put it as the 10th, and that was the time at which the clock started ticking on the 72 hours for the return of all the prisoners of war. So what did Israel gain? Of course, it gained the return of the prisoners of war, which in Israeli society was huge. And it won something of a reputation as open to being part of an agreement. I mean, that reputation has been so badly sullied worldwide that many of the governments in Europe are so eager to rehabilitate Israel based on anything or nothing, like Eurovision Song Contest is no longer going to be discussing the possibility of excluding Israel. I'm sure that arms shipments and military cooperation from European nations will just continue, or rather resume, pouring at full speed into Israel. So Israel gained a lot by signing on. What did the resistance gain and the people of Gaza? I think what they gained is not trivial. They won the end of the bombardment. That was huge. And, all the other forms of attack. They won the ability to return to their homes. They won the return of some of the, I think it was originally 11,000 prisoners. Now there are only 9,000 prisoners, political prisoners, Palestinians being held in Israeli torture dungeons. They won the return of some bodies. I guess you'll be discussing this with Jon later on. They won the possibility of some stabilization of their society and possibility of some rebuilding. And they won the re-engagement of the UN aid agencies, though I gather this does not immediately include UNRWA, but other UN and international aid agencies. But I have to say that all of these gains, achievements, victories that they got from the agreement are extremely vulnerable to Israeli, the Israeli-US war axis just resuming the war whenever they want. They're vulnerable. They are partial, and they're very mixed. It's so wonderful to be able to return to your neighborhood in Gaza City, but then you get there and the place is completely leveled to the ground. You get to embrace, your son or your brother who's been in a jail, but you see tangibly how horribly he has been tortured. So, they're all mixed in terms of achievements, but that doesn't mean, it was a gamble, as Jeremy Scahill had said, and it remains a gamble, but I think it was a gamble worth taking.
Yeah. Helena, less than a week into the implementation of this very, very fragile deal, where do you think things stand right now, and how do you assess its prospects in the next couple hours or days, let alone weeks or months?
So Nora, I'll just take a very mechanistic view of this. It could go in three directions. It could proceed with drums and trumpets toward the full implementation of the end of the occupation. But that is not going to happen, clearly, because of the missing 14 points of that this deal started off in Trump's fantasy that he revealed on September 29th in a meeting, in the meeting he had with Netanyahu here in Washington, D.C. And he said, I've got this 20-point peace plan. Well, it wasn't a peace plan. It was a colonial diktat. This is how it's going to be. And my buddy, the fellow colonial chief, Netanyahu, and I have agreed this is how it's going to be. So that was the origin, the 20-point plan. Hamas negotiators were super smart, and their response to this was to welcome the plan and then to engage positively on the 6 points that they wanted to engage positively on. And they didn't mention a thing about the other 14 points. And that's important to recall, to remember that those 14 points, Hamas has never said yes, it's never said no. Silence. So might this plan lead to the end of the occupation? No. This plan is not leading to the end of the occupation, but we'll get into kind of the geopolitics of this a little bit more, I hope. But it's possible that I look at the plan as a kind of a holding action for the resistance, and it's worth having that holding action. It's so much better to have this situation than the situation that existed a month ago.
Yeah. Well,
but it's vulnerable. So, if they can just hold this, that's worth something.
Yeah. Well, we will get back into some of those questions, but let's take a look and get your view about the situation inside Israel. Now that the prisoners of war have been released and bodies of the captives that were in Gaza are being returned, many or most likely killed by Israel itself, how do you see the political dynamics in Israel shifting? The prisoners of war were the main pretext for continuing the genocide. Has Hamas calculated that by taking away that pretext, Israel will have a harder time both internally and internationally returning to full-scale war? And do you think, in fact, that it will, or is it still completely unrestrained?
Good question, Ali. The fact that the prisoners of war were still being held by the resistance in Gaza was a pretext for the genocide, but it was only a pretext. So, that pretext has been withdrawn now. So if the US-Israeli axis does resume the genocide, which is still a very live possibility, then they won't have the pretext. But I think actually the politics inside Israel are quite scary right now, because actually the fact that the resistance was holding onto the prisoners of war did act as a kind of a brake on Israeli militarism in Gaza, because the prisoners of war themselves were vulnerable to the large-scale bombings, and so many Israelis understood that. So a lot of this social movement that grew up in Israel in support of the hostages and criticizing Netanyahu and whatever, I see that as being completely deflated now. There is continuing criticism of Netanyahu for all the things that people have criticized him for several years now, but they can no longer criticize him for putting the lives of the prisoners of war in jeopardy. So it in a sense, I think it strengthens his hand in Israeli politics, because the desire for genocide certainly still exists, you know, amongst broad swathes of Israelis. We saw, for example, even as they were preparing to withdraw from the eastern suburbs of Gaza City, they were torching the wastewater treatment plant, you know, joyfully on TikTok. Like, here we are, you know. I mean, that is not a minority position in Jewish Israeli society. And those people, those genocidaires, will feel themselves even more empowered now.
Yeah. And of course, I mean, Trump was talking about this, all of the, you know, corporate media pundits and everyone is expecting now that that the resistance is going to agree to surrender and disarm and demilitarize. Do you think there's any chance that this is going to happen? You know, surrendering to Israel, what Israel has failed to do for 2 years, to take by force. You know, that Hamas and the other resistance factions are going to just help Israel disarm, because they couldn't do it themselves.
No, that is not going to happen, clearly. I think one of the kind of the dynamics underneath this October 10th agreement is that all three of these parties, that is Israel, Hamas and its allies, and the United States, had gotten to a place where they wanted it. And they all have wanted to describe it as a victory for their side. And there's some truth in that in all cases, except for Donald Trump. I don't give him anything, but, you know, okay, he did nail down this agreement that was ready to be nailed down in December of 2023 by some accounts, or according to the Qataris, it was ready to be nailed down in May of 2024. But Biden, by refusing to bring any pressure to bear on Netanyahu, encouraged him and armed him and supported him to continue to do this. And Donald Trump has done the same. But, you know, finally, Donald Trump wanted the Nobel Peace Prize. We know that. And he had hoped, you know, by launching this thing at the time of the General Assembly in mid-September, that he would have some victory to send to the Norwegians in order to win his Peace Prize. I mean, he's quite blatant about it. He's quite blatant about so many things. I will say, since I did actually write a book about the Nobel Peace Prize 25 years ago, that the Nobel Peace Prize is nothing really but a kind of peace-washing attempt by Alfred Nobel, who was a major war profiteer and a pillar of the European military-industrial complex. He thought, oh, let's, you know, use some of my ill-gotten gains to make this thing called a peace prize. So, you know, that is my current view of the Nobel Peace Prize. And I don't think we should actually give the Nobel Peace Committee or the Peace Prize as a phenomenon any attention at all. We should start something called the Electronic Intifada Peace Prize. That would be one worth having.
I mean, if you have Kissinger and Obama and this, you know, Venezuela pro-Trump opposition, anti-socialist, you know, pro-imperialist, now just last week winning it, that's you know, the worth of the prize is what they put into it. But yes, I mean, just remind us historically, what happens when resistance factions in Palestine and in Lebanon, for example, have agreed to surrender or partially disarm. What happens? Is it all peace and rainbows for them afterwards? Does Israel say, finally, we'll stop bombing you. What happens?
Well, you know, in 1982, there was an agreement that Ronald Reagan and Philip Habib mediated, under which the Israelis would withdraw, because they had just, I think, 8 or 10 weeks earlier invaded Lebanon massively, right up to Beirut. So under the 1982 peace agreement, they would withdraw from Beirut and then further to the south. And the PLO leadership at that time, Yasser Arafat, would take all their armed people out of Lebanon. And there were boats, and they sailed off to Tunis and Yemen and various places on the understanding that they had the word of the United States of America for the peace and security of the unarmed Palestinian refugees left behind in the refugee camps of Lebanon. And within 5 weeks, we had the massacres in the refugee camps of Sabra and Shatila. I used to teach English to a group of girls in Shatila camp back in the 1970s. It broke my heart to see, like, the thousands. We won't ever know how many thousands of people were massacred by the Israelis and their local allies. So, you know, the word of the United States on one of these plans is worth nothing. And obviously, Palestinians all know that. I'm not telling them anything they don't know. But it's really problematic for Hamas, which has said, and for many years now, that they are prepared to decommission their military forces in the context of having an independent Palestinian state. And that is what happens in all decolonization transitions, you know, has happened for decades, that the Mau Mau or the FLN in Algeria or any of these national liberation movements that have fought against foreign colonialism, once they achieve national sovereignty, national independence, they dissolve their fighting forces into the military of the new state. So I would hope that we have some movement toward an independent Palestinian state, even on a portion of Gaza. And I know, you know, that's already a little bit of a pipe dream, but as Rashid Khalidi said very recently, all these European states that are recognizing the state of Palestine, where do they expect it to be? You know, a state isn't just like up in the air, it's on ground, it's on territory. And there is a possibility, I think, that it could start in this part of Gaza, in particular if international actors, and we all need to work for this, really get serious about opening up the sea lanes, the sea route to Gaza so that Gaza can have direct access to the international community.
So, Helena, I want to just push you again on, or just get your answer again regarding this issue of the Trump plan. Do you think? I mean, there was a point where Trump, you know, he's given very mixed messages, not untypical for him, where he's talked about, you know, Hamas must disarm. They have to or will disarm them. Of course, he has no way of doing that. Israel couldn't do it after 2 years. At the same time, he said, well, we've let them keep their weapons for now, which suggests that they might have a more pragmatic view of this. Do you think that that is going to be a point at which this whole thing comes apart and Israel uses that as a pretext to resume the genocide? I mean, this is almost like, I'm putting you on the spot, almost yes, no. What do you think? Can they find a way around it?
I think they can have very prolonged negotiations And the Palestinian resistance doesn't even need to be a participant in these negotiations at the beginning. I mean, there are the three mediating states, Qatar and Egypt and Turkey, all of which are, in a sense, on the spot now, because they've all kind of agreed to be co-mediators with Washington. So I think there's a real possibility there will be prolonged negotiations between these three local. I mean, they're all actually U.S.
Well, let's talk about that. Let's go into that now, because actually, just a few days ago, on October 11th, the Washington Post published an exclusive story with the headline, "Arab States Expanded Cooperation with Israeli Military During Gaza War Files Show." And it's based on leaked documents from CENTCOM, the US Central Command. And it states, I'll just read a couple of sentences, quote, "Even as key Arab states condemned the war in the Gaza Strip, they quietly expanded security cooperation with the Israeli military. Leaked US documents reveal those military ties were thrown into crisis after Israel's September airstrike in Qatar, but could now play a key role in overseeing the nascent ceasefire in Gaza. Over the past 3 years, facilitated by the United States, senior military officials from Israel and 6 Arab countries came together for planning meetings in Bahrain, Egypt, Jordan, and Qatar." The article also reveals that, quote, "Even as security cooperation with Israel expanded behind closed doors, Arab leaders denounced this war in Gaza. The leaders of Egypt, Jordan, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia said the Israeli campaign amounted to a genocide," end quote. And then one more sentence here. The article states that CENTCOM personnel, quote, "led planning meetings to launch information operations to counter Iran's narrative that it is the regional protector of Palestinians, and, according to a 2025 document, to propagate a partner narrative of regional prosperity and cooperation." What are your thoughts on this and the seeming subservience of so many countries and even the United Nations to US hegemony, which we saw at that Sharm el-Sheikh summit? But how can these countries be any check or balance when they are seemingly so much in the pocket of Israel and the United States?
Yeah, that Washington Post article was certainly very interesting. I mean, we know that this kind of military cooperation has been going on a lot. And obviously when the Israelis struck at Doha, Qatar, trying to kill the Hamas negotiators back on September 9th, I think it was, that I think the Qataris and those other Arab collaborating states took it as a very personal affront to their dignity, obviously, and the cooperation that they had given to Israel and the United States. So I was just listening to Ambassador Chaz Freeman talking about the state of the region earlier this morning, and he actually referred to the eunuch level of the subservience of many of these Arab states to American power, which I think kind of captures it in a sense. So Turkey, first of all, we need to remember, is a full member of NATO. Egypt is bound by many clauses of that Egyptian-Israeli peace agreement that is policed by a US-led force, not a UN-led force. And Qatar has had under-the-table relations with Israel for a very long time, and of course hosts the largest US base in West Asia, US military base there. So it's not surprising that they are all working with the Israelis in spite of, I mean, working with them at the military level, and with CENTCOM in particular. CENTCOM has been working with very closely with Israel and Arab states for many years now. and they have this Admiral Brad Cooper, who is the director of CENTCOM. I think he's currently in Israel leading this unit that's supposed to be supervising or monitoring the ceasefire. Do these countries have public opinion? Yes, they do. In Egypt, the public opinion is very, very tightly policed and oppressed. You will recall when there was the attempt to have an aid march to Gaza from Egypt, the Egyptian authorities just clamped down extremely hard. And Sisi himself, we need to remember, came into power through a military coup that he launched with the support of primarily the United Arab Emirates back in 2013, in which he overthrew the democratically elected Muslim Brotherhood government in Egypt. So he is, absolutely no friend of Hamas, which, had its origins with the Muslim Brotherhood, very similar kind of approach to politics. So it's hard. Turkey does have public opinion, very strongly in favor of the Palestinians and the resistance in Gaza, and allowed a certain amount of ability to express themselves and to organize. For Qatar, I think it's hard to think that there is anything that you could call Qatari public opinion. Maybe there are a few sheikhs or whatever, emirs in Qatar who are a little bit upset by the relationship with the United States, but then, they go and give all this stuff to Donald Trump and to his children, and they invest all this stuff in the Bitcoin or whatever it is that the Trump family is trying to huckster around the world. So there is a possibility that public opinion can, in those three countries and throughout West Asia more broadly, can influence those three governments. And there are also other actors internationally, specifically China and the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRICS. So I think we need to build on all of these pillars in order to build the resistance to this colonial retaking of all of Gaza. So, under the 6 points of the plan, Hamas and the resistance have a sort of a temporary and, as I said, vulnerable hold on about 50% of Gaza's terrain. But
let's talk about the situation in Gaza, which relates to the these Arab states, because under Trump's plan, and this has been the fantasy for a while, the Arab states will ride in as a proxy force. Turkey is willing to participate in that. And there are these fantasies that Hamas would collapse, and then, an Arab proxy force would go in, and then eventually Palestinian Authority forces trained by Jordan and Egypt. But the reality is that Hamas has moved to reassert governance very quickly. They appear to be completely well organized and ready to take up their positions and start restoring law and order. And this is how it's being presented in Western media. Let's look at this article from the Washington Post, Helena. The headline there: Hamas reasserts control on streets of Gaza, turning guns on its rivals. What do you have to say about that framing?
Well, all the Western media has been so deeply bought and paid for, by Zionist, various Zionist bodies, that I'm not surprised by the framing. But actually the content of that article is worth reading, because it cites people who work with the PA intelligence and security forces in Ramallah as saying that they had actually been working with some of these anti-Hamas units inside Gaza, possibly for quite some time, with Israeli help and under the support of the Israelis. So that was interesting to me that this article revealed that. There's also today in Times of Israel a report that a significant number of trucks were full of armaments were in the hands of these PA people in Gaza, and they got seized by Hamas in the days that the ceasefire started to go into operation, which, you know, in a sense, that would be a major loss for the Israelis and for the PA if that had happened. I think that obviously Hamas and the resistance people have very complicated relationships with Fatah and the PA. And it's worth remembering that practically every single family in the West Bank and Gaza has some people who are working with the PA and some people who are working with the resistance. You know, and when they're in a family gathering, they can kind of laugh about it or talk about it or explore ideas or challenge each other. But when they get called up by their various, you know, when the PA people, you know, have to go and receive their orders from the US-Israeli, you know, colonial powers, then they have to do what they're told to do in order to receive their salary. But, you know, there's a lot of, let's say, fuzziness. You know, it's not like, let's say, Kurds versus Arabs in Syria. You know, you have some Kurdish families and some Arab families. It's not like what I encountered when I was covering the war in Lebanon, that, you know, you have Sunni Muslims and you have Maronite Christians and you have Druze and, you know, they're kind of separate communities. No, I mean, the communities in the West Bank and Gaza are all very intermixed. So I think there is a possibility that smart Hamas outreach to I mean, they obviously already have relationships with the 𝐓𝐡𝐞 𝐄𝐥𝐿 which is a portion, a break-off from Fatah. They have relations with Al-Aqsa Martyr Brigades, which originated as a Fatah militia. So they might be able to reach out and bring over the bulk of the PA to the resistance side. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but it's definitely a possibility. I've talked about this with Moin Rabbani a number of times. He says it's not going to be doable so long as Abu Mazen is alive. Abu Mazen is a very old man, as you can see when he appears. But
that's Mahmoud Abbas, of course.
Yeah, sorry. So that's one possibility. And certainly the PA has gotten nothing on the ground in the West Bank, except continuous and settlement and terrorism from the Israeli settlers and land theft and oppression from the settlers and Ben-Gvir and all his people in the Israeli government. So the incentive for Palestinians throughout Palestine to continue to be supportive of the PA and of Fatah is very low. I mean,
yeah. Maybe talk just a little bit more about the political situation in the West Bank and where, I mean, where it goes from here. You know, I mean, the West Bank has been, you know, somewhat obscured by the genocide in Gaza. As you mentioned, you know, Mahmoud Abbas has long been regarded as a quisling and has been very open about his, you know, his desire to keep collaborating with Israel. What situation does the kind of like fomenting, growing resentment against the PA look like on the ground in the West Bank, and how is that related to what's happening in Gaza?
I think for those of us in the West that focusing on saving Palestinian land in the West Bank should become now a much higher priority, because we've been so focused on getting a ceasefire in Gaza. We have a ceasefire. It is vulnerable and reversible, but it is still like it's a holding action, and we need to try to make sure that it's not rolled back. But that allows us to pay a whole lot more attention to these outrageous things that have been happening in the West Bank, where there is active presence by many Western, I won't say EU governments, because we know that the EU governments are not doing anything to protect the rights of Palestinians in the West Bank. But there are NGOs and a lot of civil society activists, and with good links. And of course, you have a lot of Christian sites and links that people in the West Bank have with Western society, more perhaps than Gaza people. So I think that if we want to think about the campaigns for Palestinian rights and where they go in the next few months, that obviously securing the ceasefire in Gaza is really important. Now that we've won it, we need to, defend it. And then defending the lands and rights of Palestinians in the West Bank. In a sense, it all becomes one again. And just continuing to expose the lies and Hasbara and violence of the Zionist project. So is that going to be easier in the West now? Or is it going to be harder now that we've got the ceasefire? I mean, I would hate for people to just, rest back on their laurels and say, oh, we got the ceasefire, that's it. No, the ceasefire is just like the first of 1,000 steps that we need. So rolling back, I mean, actually going from this partial and very vulnerable ceasefire to ending the occupation wherever that is possible, and actually being able to implement some of those rulings of the International Court of Justice that say that Israel's occupation everywhere in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and in Gaza, Israel's occupation everywhere is illegal. So, do we stand for international law? Or are we, prepared to go home and say, oh, the Israeli prisoners of war have been released and therefore everything is okay? No, I don't think anybody watching this live stream is going to rest. But we do need to think a little bit strategically about how to get to the next stage of actually rolling back the occupation. So there are international allies, a lot of international allies, and there's a kind of there's a lot going on at the international level. I can't go into all of the details of it, because there's so much, but Trump's tariff policies have pissed off everybody worldwide, which is good. And then, you have the extension of Chinese and BRICS economic power and military power to a certain extent. So, for example, the Pakistanis recently won a very significant series of battles against the Indians. The Pakistanis were using Chinese military technology, and the Indians were using both a combination of Western military technology and very outdated Soviet Russian technology. So now we have, the Pakistanis in a military alliance, training alliance with Saudi Arabia. We're going to see and we've already seen for a number of years now, the extension of Chinese military tech, Chinese intel mechanisms and communications mechanisms, which the Iranians already have to a large extent. We're going to see the extension of that further across West Asia, which will diminish US military power, which has often been based on the US selling like a lot of totally overpriced military junk to GCC countries with the idea that that could protect them. It did not protect the people of the Qatari capital, Doha, when the Israelis chose to come in and kill 6 people there. So things are changing at the international level in many different ways. I think this holding action for the people of Gaza is the best thing that they can do to hold on to what they can of normal life, of restarting, schools and hospitals and rebuilding homes, to hold on to what they can until the international geopolitical balance shifts even more against the United States. And I think it's happening. But I know it's hard for people in Gaza to be able to just survive like winter coming on.
And that's, the point you make, it's a point I think many of us have been making, Helena, that's so important. It's so important that people don't go home just because a ceasefire has been achieved. People need to still be out in the streets. They still need to be pressuring their governments. They still need to be making sure that the realities in Gaza, the voices of people in Gaza are being heard, because the Western media that enabled this genocide and the governments that enabled this genocide will be working as quickly as they can to sweep this all under the rug, because the last thing they want is accountability. I mean, some of the horrors that are just being revealed in the past few days, bodies being found under the rubble, and that's without sufficient equipment to dig. The bodies that have been returned from Gaza, returned to Gaza from Israel, showing signs of torture, people with bodies with garrotes around their necks, blindfolded, or things tied around their necks. I'm not going to share the link to this, but the health ministry in Gaza has actually published these photos on a special site whose goal is to help family members identify them. So I've looked at the photos of these bodies, and they're absolutely horrible. So given that context, they're going to want to sweep this all under the rug. And as you said, particularly the Europeans, go back to business as usual. The EU never imposed a single sanction on Israel throughout all this. Some individual countries did, but the EU did nothing. And now they want to go, they're going to want to go back to Israel. Oh, our friend, scientific cooperation, tea parties, dinner parties with Israeli officials, Eurovision, they already held. I mean, it's utterly grotesque, but the new EU envoy in Tel Aviv, Michael Mann, actually held like an EU science night at the rubble of the Weizmann Institute with Israeli children. Remember, the Weizmann Institute was founded by the Israeli Defense Ministry as a weapons lab. That is where Israel develops its biological, chemical, and other weapons, as well as all sorts of other dastardly weaponry. And the EU is already whitewashing this as just, oh, it's this lovely science place, and the EU loves science and biomedical science and so on. So anyway, I'm taking a long digression here to stress the point. Do not let up. Do not let these people get away with genocide. They were complicit, and now they're going to try to masquerade as the saviors, supporting aid and supporting peace. No, don't let them do it. Helena, I see you're eager to talk, but I'm gonna wrap this in a sort of a final question for you. Of course, respond however you want to, but also just before we let you go, are there any other issues that you want to bring up or things you think we should be paying attention to?
I would say that I think calls for accountability are important, but they can also be a diversion. I think the important thing, the number one job has to be to end all these violations. And these violations are not ended with this ceasefire. We know there are another 7,000 prisoners inside Israeli jails.
9,100.
Yeah,
I checked this
Abu
morning.
Safia and so many others. And we know that they are being majorly mistreated. But what we need to do is to end all of those violations. Marwan Barghouti, when they paraded him, like, poor guy. I mean, oh gosh. And of course, I want to obviously give a shout out here to the work of the people from the Global Samud Flotilla and the other flotillas, because they experienced just a little bit of what happened in Israeli jails. You know, if Ben Gvir's goons will treat white Europeans like that, just imagine how they are treating, you know, captive Palestinians, whether from Gaza or the West Bank or wherever. So to me, the central thing is, while we're documenting and building, I know there are these wonderful organizations like the Hind Rajab Foundation and many others that are building the documentary base for future accountability projects. But the job one has to be to end the violations. And the big violation is Israel's lengthy military occupation of Gaza and the West Bank. And that's what needs to be ended. So if we can take this little, you know, this little portion of Gaza and use that as a way to start to roll back the Israeli occupation, that would be great. If we can mount really strong campaigns for all the Palestinian prisoners, that's great. You know, there are so many tasks that we need to be undertaking. And, you know, I'm just really delighted to be able to be with you guys and talk about this stuff.
Thank you so much, Helena. There is much work to do. And again, your article in Globalities, which is published by Just World Educational, which your director addresses many of these issues, and I encourage people to regularly check into Just World Educational. You, of course, did just remind us briefly about the project you did during this genocide, the Hamas, Understanding Hamas, because it's now in book form.
Yeah, so this was something we did last year. Honestly, this was a book that we produced just over a year ago based on a series of webinars that Rami Khouri and I co-hosted with 5 experts on Hamas. And the goal was to demonize Hamas. And of course, the demonization of Hamas continues. So I think the book is still a really good resource for people if they want to, you know, understand Hamas better and join us in, you know, demonizing it and understanding it. So yeah, I was pleased to do that. It was funny when we were doing the webinars in spring of 2024, Rami and I were like, oh, but what if there's a ceasefire next week, you know, and should we continue with the project? And here we are, like 18 months later, and the ceasefire has only just, in a very vulnerable and precarious way, been put into operation. So yeah, the book still needs to be used by people who want to challenge the demonization of Hamas.
And it's called Understanding Hamas and Why That Matters, and people can find it wherever books are sold, and they can find more about your work and the work of people you cooperate with at Just World Educational. Helena, thank you as always. We'll have you back again before long, I hope, and thank you for all the great work you do to make sense of this situation.
Well, it's a long task, but thank you, Ali and Nora and all of your team, because you guys are like, you've just been on it for 2.5 years now.
Thanks,
and
Helena.
we'll remain on it. Thank you so much, Helena, for all your work. Oh, she's always just such a clarifying analyst, and I'm always so grateful for the time that we spend with her. So, yeah, thanks, Helena.
And there's a lot. It's all a lot to take in, so it's good to have some of that big picture analysis.
Yeah, because things remain very dynamic and fluid, just hour by hour here. And let's bring on Jon, because hey, Jon.
Hello. Excellent
Hi,
interview,
Jon.
as always.
Yeah.
Helena's great to hear from.
Yeah. And, she was talking a lot about the kind of broader historical context. And you're going to be speaking about the specific kind of history of these sort of prisoner exchanges, captive exchanges, swaps, however you want to call it. I don't know, just before we get into it, I'm curious about how you're seeing the vulnerability of this this very fragile ceasefire right now. How are you?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like Jeremy said, it's a gamble, but it's a gamble that the resistance had to take for their people. They're accountable to their people, and the genocide had to stop. And so they're not in it for their own personal glory. They're representing their people, and their people wanted the war to end. And they heard that. They took a risk on it. And I think we'll have to just see how it goes. But it's devastating. I mean, Gaza is devastated.
It's beyond measure.
It's a difficult moment. Broken up by the pure joy of people who were sentenced to death, were thought to be put into their graves, being free. And that's happened a number of times in Palestinian history, and they were very important moments in history. So that's what I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about this week.
Wonderful. All right, Ali, you want to do the honor?
Yeah, take it away, Jon.
All right. So you are watching and listening to the Electronic Intifada. I am Jon Elmer. This is the Resistance Report for day 741 of Israel's genocide. It is day 7 of the third ceasefire, and I am reporting this on the 16th of October. I've been starting these segments for the past few months with maps showing the migration, the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians from Gaza City. I want to just show you a picture that's not a map. This is the reversal of those maps that I have been showing you. I hated showing those maps. They're awful maps that in some ways, I think a little bit normalized that driving people out of their homes was somehow for Israel a moral, that they thought it was a legal and a moral cover for the genocide that they were committing rather than an accelerator of that genocide. But this is people crossing back to Gaza City along Al-Rashid, the coastal road. And this is the second time we've seen this happen in this war. And I just thought I would put a human face on some of those maps that we usually start out with. On Friday at noon local time in Palestine, the ceasefire went into effect. Immediately, the government stepped forward, civil defense, who has always been there, the municipality, all of the functioning of the state all stepped forward immediately after the ceasefire. Most were there through the entire genocide. And Israel failed to achieve its goals. Its goal of genocide, it certainly accomplished many parts of that. Much of that, if not all of it, will be rebuilt by Palestinians. It's already being being rebuilt. It has been rebuilt during the war itself. The Qassam brigades were not defeated. The government was not defeated. The United Nations Relief Works Agencies for Palestinian Affairs, the UNRWA, sort of the backbone of the state system, was not defeated. And Israel's failure to achieve these military goals were well known within Israel. Their military correspondents and security analysts were all very clear on the fact that the goals were not achieved and that Netanyahu was trying to spin them as achievements. There's talk within Israel about what going back to war will look like. The defense minister met with the chief of staff to plan for the return to war. But Trump told CNN yesterday, if Israel were capable of crushing Hamas, it would have done so already, which I think is a pretty obvious statement. But it's something that we need to keep our eyes peeled for. What we're looking at here on the screen is pictures from Khan Yunis, from the release of the captives, Palestinian prisoners that were released, many of them released from that were bargaining chips that were taken to prison camps for no reason other than that they were in shelters or hospitals at the time the Israeli military raided it. And if you're not seeing the images on the screen and you're listening to this program, we're looking at buses arriving to floods of people. Some people on the ground that day said that it was the largest gathering of people that they can remember in southern Gaza. And it was a moment of joy of the release of these captives. Of course, the BBC reported, and others reported as well, that there was no celebrations allowed, particularly in the West Bank, where there was similar buses and crowds in the West Bank as well. Qassam released a statement about this. They said, what has been reached in terms of an agreement is the fruit of the steadfastness of our people and the resilience of its fighters, and we announce our commitment to the agreement reached and the associated timelines, provided that the occupation adheres to it. The resistance has always been keen to stop the war of genocide and has sought to do so since the first months, but the enemy thwarted all efforts due to its narrow calculations and to satisfy its instinct of monstrous brutality and revenge of its Nazi government. The enemy failed to recover its prisoners through military pressure, despite its intelligence superiority and excess force it possesses, and here it is submitting and recovering its prisoners through an exchange deal, as the resistance had promised from the beginning. The Nazi occupation could not have recovered most of its prisoners alive. The Nazi occupation could have recovered most of its prisoners alive many months ago, as we all know, but it continued to stall and act arrogantly, preferring that its army kill dozens of them as a result of its failed military pressure policy. To our free prisoners, Gaza and its resistance have offered the most precious things they possess and have strived to the utmost of their ability to break your chains. And we pledge that your cause will remain at the top of our national priorities until all of you achieve your freedom. So, very straightforward messages from Qassam to the resistance. Similar ones I'll show you from 𝐓𝐡𝐞 𝐄𝐥𝐞 coming up. But this exchange, this is the third prisoner exchange of this war. It saw 250 life sentences, prisoners with life sentences exchanged for the 20 living POWs, all soldiers that were returned from Gaza pretty much immediately after the ceasefire was implemented. They didn't wait the 72 hours that they had. 250 life sentences out of 303 prisoners with life sentences. Israel put a veto on many of the key leadership officials that people had hoped would be released: Marwan Barghouti, Ahmed Saadat, principally the leaders of Fatah and the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Marwan Barghouti always sort of touted as a reasonable leader should there be ever free and fair elections in Palestine. The prisoners' media office confirmed that 3,985 Palestinian prisoners were freed in the exchanges of the Flood of the Free. It's included 503 prisoners serving life sentences, representing 87% of all life sentences of prisoners held in occupation prisons. The deal secured the freedom of 13 pre-Oslo prisoners, so from the 1980s, 41 that were rearrested after the 2011 Wafa Arar exchange. That's the Gilad Shalit exchange. We'll talk about that in a moment. And 2,718 Gaza prisoners were also freed, 114 women, 297 children, and 33 others who were expecting to be sentenced to life sentences were released. So significant releases we're seeing here. The prisoners in the buses. This is a scene that we have seen at each of the releases, and each of the releases going back through history. These are the ones from yesterday from ActiveStills. This is a Doaa Albaz photograph for ActiveStills. Hamas said, "The flood of the free is a historic national achievement that embodied the unity of our people and confirmed that their resistance and adherence to the land and national rights is the way to liberate the land, achieve return, and build the independent Palestinian state. Today's joy and liberation of our heroic prisoners in the flood of the free is an important station in a continuous path until the comprehensive liberation of our land is achieved." So direct statements by 𝐓𝐡𝐞 and the Hamas leadership. And take a look at Soraya Al-Quds, who had similar statements. They released this poster: "Congratulations on your freedom. We fulfilled the promise." This is a poster from Soraya Al-Quds. A commander in Soraya Al-Quds said, "We handed over a number of Zionist prisoners this morning." That was on the first day. "In implementation of the ceasefire understandings, we are committed to the ceasefire understandings as long as the occupation adheres to them. The steadfastness and resilience of our people led to the achievement of freeing our prisoners and stopping the war." Also to note from Islamic Jihad, Deputy Secretary General Dr. Mohammed Al-Hindi about disarmament told Al Jazeera that the resistance factions did not agree to disarmament. "We do not accept the threat of disarming by force." And Palestinian Islamic Jihad Secretary General Ziad Nakala, who himself was freed in a prisoner exchange, as we'll talk about in a moment, he said, "What was achieved today, the liberation of a large number of prisoners belonging to the resistance and the Palestinian people, would not have been possible without the men of the resistance, the valor of the fighters in the field, and the unity of the Palestinian people behind the resistance. Yes, we had hoped that the results would have been better, more people, but our people are not unaware of the balance of power and the many variables and factors that surround our people in Gaza in particular. The banners of the resistance remained high and unbroken. The resistance remained in the field, and our people remained proud, dignified, and committed to their resistance. The goal of liberating the rest of our brave prisoners will not fall from the priorities of the resistance." So again, Soraya Al-Quds and 𝐓𝐡𝐞, the two leading movements of the Joint Operations Room, in unison on that, and all of the other factions also chimed in on that as well. So let's take a look at some of the handovers, because the handover ceremonies that we saw in the second prisoner exchange, those were not allowed this time. Israel vetoed those. Fighters organized. They didn't like that their prisoners said that they were treated well, and they didn't like to see all of the symbolism that 𝐓𝐡𝐞 put into those, and Soraya and the other factions put into those handovers. The ratio of handovers is 15 Palestinian bodies for each Israeli bodies. So far, 9 have been returned. There are 19 remaining. 𝐓𝐡𝐞 said about that the resistance has adhered to what was agreed upon and handed over all the living prisoners it had and the bodies it can access. As for the remaining bodies, they require great efforts and special equipment to search and retrieve them, and we are making great efforts to close this file. Of course, it's very difficult to find the prisoners that Israel killed through their airstrikes, through the destruction, as you can see on this picture of the Red Cross convoy taking the bodies that were known to be killed, and Hamas and Qassam had buried those bodies and returned them. But you can see all around is just total destruction. And so these 19 Israelis that you're going to hear about in the news a lot in the coming weeks, just remember that there's 10,000 Palestinians under the rubble as well that cannot be found. And the prisoners that were killed by Israeli fire were killed in buildings that dropped on top of them. They were killed in tunnels that were bombed and had buildings dropped on top of those tunnels. It's a very difficult process to get them out. We can see in this next slide, the Qassam shadow unit was out again in the streets for these handovers. You can see the patch on the sleeve of that shadow unit fighter there. We can keep looking at these shadow unit pictures. There's a bunch from this handover that you can see. We saw the shadow unit really in its most public form during the January handovers. The shadow unit has been known about since 2006, since the Gilad Shalit capture, when the shadow unit was stood up by Mohammed Sinwar and Mohammed al-Deif to look after the prisoners, and that's their primary job. And they executed that job flawlessly. No prisoners were found, despite the $5 million offered by Netanyahu. Nobody in Gaza turned over the locations of prisoners. So the shadow unit has a moment to be acknowledged here. And if we look at this next poster here, Qassam has done that. This poster released by Qassam the other day says the shadow unit's unknown fighters, with their efforts, the promise was fulfilled. The promise is, of course, the promise to return the prisoners. Qassam said in the statement, a deserved salute to the unknown soldiers of the shadow unit who maintained the enemy captives over 2 years of Al-Aqsa flood under extremely complex conditions and exerted their efforts and blood for this until the resistance's promise of freedom for our prisoners was fulfilled. The shadow unit has been known in Gaza for most of the last decade and a half, although their logo was released in 2016 for the first time, acknowledged after the 2014 war, when 2 more Israeli soldiers were taken into Qassam captivity. If we take a look at these, this is from the second exchange. People remember this. This is the shadow unit returning Israelis in captured vehicles from October 7th that were taken from an Israeli military base. And these kind of symbolisms that were seen in Israel, because in Israel, they don't watch Gaza, but they did watch the handover of Israeli captives. And so all of Israel was watching this, and they immediately noticed these symbolisms, like that truck was taken from an Israeli military base. That's an Israeli military truck. The shadow unit soldiers themselves were carrying captured Israeli weapons, Tavor rifles that were captured from Israelis on October the 7th. So this is from the second exchange. There's a couple more shots of the shadow unit during that exchange that you can see. And Tarek Azoum, who you saw in Nora's report, talked about these. This is in the second exchange in January of 2025, that all the Al Jazeera reporters were waiting. Everyone was waiting for the captives to arrive, and Tarek Azoum said that the cars emerged out of nowhere. So these guys are able to execute these operations under the strictest eye and still be able to effectively protect the prisoners' lives, take care of them. They eat what we eat is their motto. And they're very good at what they do. The captives, the entire Israeli and American and British intelligence and surveillance forces were trying the entire time, round the clock, to find these captives, and they were unable to do that. And the job of these shadow unit soldiers, they take very seriously, because ultimately, as we saw in those early pictures, what the shadow unit protecting the POWs does is exchange them for Palestinians who would otherwise return to Palestine in coffins. That is the goal of life sentences, that they never return. And so these shadow unit soldiers are effectively bringing people back from the dead with these operations, and to capture soldiers and then the taking care of them in a small place that has the most surveilled piece of territory on earth, unable to find them. And that was the case with Gilad Shalit in 2006 as well. Israeli state TV in the second exchange commented, how many Hamas activists were tempted by the Israeli offer of $5 million for information on any prisoner during the war? The answer is zero, a complete zero. You don't need extensive experience in Hamas affairs to understand that they will not sell their prisoners for money. So this is the kind of tone and tenor of the second exchange that made Israelis block this from happening this time. So we didn't see those exchanges. This is the logo on the shoulder of one of the shadow unit soldiers when he's getting the command from the senior leadership to release the captives. And there's one more that shows the logo that was released in 2016 that you see there on the screen. For people who can't see, it's a fighter, and it says shadow unit underneath them. Those are the same logos that we saw on the armbands of the soldiers. But let's talk a little bit now about the history of these operations to capture Israeli soldiers. The most famous one, recent famous one, was in June 2006. And we have a mural here to show you from Jabalia that says, that shows the captured Israeli tank gunner, Gilad Shalit, who was captured at Kerem Shalom, on the other side of the boundary between Rafah and southern Israel. And he was captured in a cross-border raid, the first Qassam cross-border raid in June 2006. And I'm going to read you a little bit from the news report, a wire story from the time that captures the operation at Kerem Shalom. The attackers surprised Israeli forces when they appeared at first light through a tunnel in open ground 300 meters inside Israel. The fighters went down through the tunnel, came up behind the Israeli military position, and attacked from the back. They split into three groups, launching simultaneous attacks on three Israeli defensive positions. I mean, that they say it's defensive positions, but they're obviously offensive positions perched on the border. They blew the tank's back doors open with RPG fire and tossed grenades inside. Of the four tank crewmen, two of the tank crew died and one was severely wounded. When the Israeli soldiers went to that tank, they found the two dead soldiers and one severely wounded, and knew that another had been taken captive. They immediately crossed the border into Gaza and launched a war to try to get Gilad Shalit, the tank gunner, back. There you see him in that mural. And the point of that mural that you see on the screen, where we see Shalit on the left as a 19-year-old soldier, on the further to the right, you see on his nameplate, it says 2036. And it says, Zionists, we will not get bored. Essentially, we are patient. The prisoner file is so important that they will hold a prisoner for 30 years if you don't meet the price that the Palestinians put up for the fighters. And also, it's worth noting that I'm just covering the Palestinian prisoner releases, but a few weeks after the Shalit operation that was carried out by the Popular Resistance Committees and the Qassam Brigades, Hezbollah in the north executed a cross-border raid and captured Israeli soldiers, like I said, a few weeks later, and that sparked the July War in 2006. You can see in the next slide of, again, similar pictures. This is from the Electronic Intifada from 2011. This is the prisoner release that came about from the Shalit capture. similar to the way this one worked at the beginning, when 𝐓𝐡𝐞 was captured, the Palestinians offered 1,000 to 1 exchange that the Israelis refused. Right away, he could have gone home, but the Israelis refused. Ultimately, 5 years later, they agreed to 1,027 prisoners being released for the one Israeli soldier, including 208 life sentences that were released after 𝐓𝐡𝐞 was handed over by Qassam's top commanders at the time, Ahmed Jabari and Raed al-Attar. Their two most senior commanders were there for the actual handoff. And you can see in this next slide, the key figure that was released in that exchange was, of course, Yahya Sinwar, who had been the leader in prison for the 2.5 decades before his release. And when he came out, well, the first thing he said was, they thought prison was our graveyard, but it was our academy. And Yahya Sinwar was killed 1 year ago today in Rafah, in Tel Sultan, fighting on the front lines. And when he came out, he promised to those left behind, and it was one of the first things he said on stage. Here you see him being kissed by Ismail Haniyeh, who was himself assassinated in Iran last year, being greeted. But as soon as Sinwar came out, he promised those left behind that he would free them. And there's a couple more pictures of Yahya Sinwar. But Sinwar went right. That's Sinwar with Ismail Haniyeh and Mahmoud al-Zahar, who's the founding member of the Politburo of the Hamas movement. So these are from 2011. And you can see he came out to a hero's welcome, similar to the way that that we just saw a couple of days ago happen for the Palestinians. So that promise by Sinwar was that he would join Qassam when he got out of prison. He was the leader of Hamas, and he was the leader of the prisoners in prison. And when he came out, that he immediately took the prisoners' file before working his way up and ultimately becoming the head of Hamas in Gaza in 2017. Before that 𝐓𝐡𝐞 deal, the largest Palestinian prisoner exchange happened in 1985, after in 1983 an Israeli outpost in Lebanon during the first Lebanon war in the early 1980s was overrun by Fatah fighters, and 3 Israeli soldiers were captured. They were handed over to Ahmed Jibril of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine's General Command, PFLP-GC, who squirreled them out of Lebanon. And handled the negotiations. And for those 3 Israeli soldiers captured in Lebanon in May of 1985 that you see here from the newspaper, 1,150 Palestinian prisoners were released, including 380 prisoners who were serving life sentences. And you can see in this newspaper from the time, the headline is "Palestinians Joyously Welcome Released Prisoners," with scenes that looked the same. We couldn't find video from that. I'm sure it's all on microfiche, so it would require a longer project than we had time for here, but it's interesting to see that newspaper from Jerusalem. That's in Al-Fajr newspaper, 24th of May, 1985. Now, in the Jibril exchange, a number of important figures were released, including Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, who was in prison. He was released in 1985. Between 1985 and 1988, he founds the Hamas movement. Also released was Ziad Nakala, who took over the lead of setting up Saraya al-Quds in the Gaza Strip under the orders of Fatih Shikaki, who was the leader at the time of Islamic Jihad. And Ziad Nakala is now the General Secretary of Islamic Jihad, and we have watched on this program, in this section of the program, for the past 741 days, Saraya al-Quds fight and defend Gaza in this genocidal war. So there's still a lot of history to be written about who was released this time and how this moment in the battle will shape the future of Palestine, and that story will be written another day. But it's worth noting that Mohammed al-Deif said on October 7th that we can change the course of history. And that was the plan with October 7th, to change the course of history. That is the resistance report for day 741 of Israel's genocide. I will be in the coming weeks tracking the ceasefire and all the stuff that you are familiar with. I just wanted to bring you this history of prisoner exchanges while it was in the news.
Thank you so much for that history lesson, Professor Jon. And, there's been just a quick comment, maybe. There's been, a lot of back and forth. Helena was talking about this, the question of the release of Marwan Barghouti and Ahmed Sadat. What do we know so far about the possibility of their release, and what would that mean for the Palestinian National Project?
It was vetoed. Israel had a list of 25 names on it that were non-starters for negotiations, and Palestinians pushed on that for the entire time because the release of those figures would be very significant. Especially Marwan Barghouti, who has the capacity to unify the Palestinian political milieu, and Ahmed Sadat, who's in prison for an assassination operation that his fighters took, but he did not take himself. And he has been in prison since the beginning of the Second Intifada. It would have been significant to see those leaders released. And I think that, in the same way that Ahmed Yassin was released, it creates an image of victory. But more than that, it's the cadre that set up the next stage of the struggle for Palestinian liberation. The release in the Ahmed Jibril release in 1985 was a key stepping stone. Those fighters released became the main pillar, or one of the main pillars of the cadre that launched the first Intifada in Jabalia in 1987. And so those are very significant moments. The Shalit deal with Sinwar, you can see the history that was set in motion by that release. We can see it today. And so these are very important moments that Israel's very aware of. They try to make laws against negotiating for prisoners after each of these prisoner deals. They drag their feet on them like they did with Shalit for 5 years because they know the significance of them. And that is the reason. And it's in some ways the resistance not forgetting their fighters left behind is kind of the opposite of what Israel had shown us for the 741 days before this week, where they did leave their people behind, and they went about prioritizing genocide and destruction and killing and making TikTok videos of it over bringing their soldiers home. So I think it shows the juxtaposition between the two movements for sure.
Yeah, I have just a couple of comments on this. One is, and thank you, Jon, for that extraordinary history and presentation. I think it's so important to recall how central prisoners are in the Palestinian struggle. And it was the worsening treatment of the Palestinian prisoners before October 7th, the deliberate cruelty by Itamar Ben-Gvir, on top of the already very cruel and harsh torture-like Israeli prison conditions that have been documented by Palestinians and human rights organizations for decades. But Ben-Gvir made it considerably worse, and deliberately so. He would gloat about, denying the prisoners bread, denying them showers, really denying them basic health care, denying them dental care. Not that they were getting any of these things in anything like adequate quantities before, but that was one of the precipitating factors for October 7th, was Israel's campaign to make the prisoners suffer even more, plus the massive increase in so-called administrative detentions that was already escalating to record levels before October 7th. I think it's important to remember that, because the West wants to write this narrative that history started on October 7th. It certainly didn't start for the prisoners. And even before October 7th, according to Ad-Damir, the Palestinian prisoners' rights group, more than 700,000 Palestinians have been through Israel's dungeons since 1967. 700,000 of a relatively small people. We're not talking about the United States population of 350 million. We're talking about today there are 10 million Palestinians, and that's, or 12 million, including the diaspora, in that range. The point is, a huge number have been incarcerated. I think I want to say something about Marwan Barghouti, who has this very symbolic importance. And I said this a little bit earlier this morning on speaking to our friend Jeremy Scahill on Dropsite News. There's really two Marwan Barghoutis, if you think about it. There's Marwan Barghouti, the human being, who is being subjected to harsh treatment, worsening treatment by Israel. There's been a campaign to make him suffer even more, as there has against other prisoners, and that absolutely has to end, and he should be freed. And I believe that the negotiators would have gone as far as they could to try to get those high-profile prisoners out, and I wouldn't second-guess them. They must have concluded that that was a bridge too far, and it wasn't going to happen, and they weren't going to prevent the rest of this agreement from going ahead, the release of the other prisoners, and first and foremost an end to the genocide. So they made that call, and I wouldn't second guess them at all. But there is Marwan Barghouti, the symbol, and people project all sorts of things onto him that I think are unfair to project. For some people who are not necessarily supporters of Palestinian liberation I'm trying to find a polite way to say this, but you have a lot of liberal Zionists who see Marwan Barghouti as their hope, not necessarily a hope for Palestinians, but their hope as someone with this tough image and the credibility, having spent so many decades in Israeli prisons, that he would be the one who can come out and make concessions to Israel and force them onto the Palestinian people. And they're very explicit about that. That's why there has been sort of a liberal Zionist movement demanding the release of Marwan Barghouti. And on the other hand, you see people say, oh, Marwan Barghouti is the non-Hamas guy who can come out and crush Hamas in an election. So they see him as another tool for fighting the resistance, because again, he has this credibility. And now Marwan Barghouti hasn't come out and said he'll do any of this. This is what people are projecting onto him. And so I think we have to be very aware of these political narratives around Marwan Barghouti that are not necessarily fully in line with support for Palestinian resistance and liberation. And so, depending on the perspective you come from, and I just think we have to separate that from Marwan Barghouti, the man, who, like any other Palestinian political prisoner, should be freed now, and we would like to see him freed as soon as possible, aside from any political projects people are trying to dragoon him into with or without his consent.
Right. And his legitimacy comes from from struggle. His legitimacy comes from the Second Intifada, from arming the Tanzim in the Second Intifada, from using the weapons of the PA to fight against the Israelis in the Second Intifada. And in terms of reconciliation, he's agreed by Hamas that he is the man for reconciliation. He agreed to it in prison with the prisoners' document, a necessary step that has to happen within Palestinian society to unify the political division that has been created.
But reconciliation isn't about this personality or that personality. It's not that Marwan Barghouti can produce a reconciliation that someone else can't. Reconciliation has to be based on principles. I know this is we're straying a bit from the topic, but reconciliation isn't just about goodwill. Let's all just get along. The reason there is a fundamental division between the Palestinian political factions, and this has lasted now for almost 2 decades, is very simple. It's because one side is committed to resisting Israeli military occupation, and the other side is deeply committed to collaborating with it against the Palestinian resistance and against the Palestinian struggle. And you cannot have reconciliation between collaboration and treason on the one hand and resistance and steadfastness on the other hand. It's impossible. That's why every effort at reconciliation, so-called reconciliation, has failed. You remember all the hullabaloo in Beijing a year or 2 ago, and all the Palestinian factions went and they signed on to the umpteenth reconciliation document. But as long as the PA and Fatah remain deeply committed to what Mahmoud Abbas calls sacred security coordination with Israel, neither Marwan Barghouti nor the Prophet Muhammad nor Jesus Christ can bring about a reconciliation. Either one side has to give up its commitment to treachery and treason, or the other side has to give up resistance.
Yeah, the hope was that Marwan Barghouti could be the Fatah man who stopped that collaboration. I think that's the hope. But there's no doubt about the PA. It can't exist in reconciliation the way it's structured right now.
Well, we're all going to keep a very close eye on these very delicate developments. Meanwhile, I know, Asa, you've been watching. You watched the whole of the Trump speech, and you wanted to kind of unpack some of the details in
Read
these
the tea
political.
leaves.
Yeah, exactly. If that's at all possible when you're dealing with him. Tell us what you've been following this week.
Yeah, that's right, Nora. As you discussed with Helena earlier, of course, US President Donald Trump has signed a ceasefire deal between Israel and the Palestinian resistance, which went into effect on Friday. And as part of this deal, the Palestinian negotiators insisted on Trump personally announcing the end of the war and the withdrawal of Israeli troops from at least some of Gaza. That was really a kind of sticking point for them. So on Monday, as part of this process, Trump actually flew into occupied Palestine to give a speech at the Knesset, which of course is Israel's parliament, to seal the deal and announce what he claimed, as we saw in that clip earlier, was the end of 3,000 years of war and a new age of peace. And yeah, for my sins, I watched the entire speech. I want to take us through some of the most... I've got a few clips and some of the most notable aspects of it. But in summary, it was, as you would expect, a fawning tribute to Israel's genocidal leaders. And, they were doing this kind of thing they do in Congress in the US, where it's kind of a State of the Union speech, where they gave multiple applauses to him, and there was all lots of mutual congratulations. And it was partly a kind of rambling train of consciousness, or it seemed like it was. It seemed to be going off script sometimes. And some of the audience certainly looked a little bit uncomfortable at times as well. But be that as it may, it was, there were certainly some significant things said. How much to believe is another question. When and that, regardless of Trump or not, that's always the case when it comes to U.S. leaders, Western political leaders in general, full stop. But first of all, Trump, on his way to flying into Tel Aviv, he talked to the press pack on Air Force One, and he said several things of significance there too that I want to go through. So the first was that he was asked by one of the journalists about as we talked about earlier in the stream, the potential involvement of former British Prime Minister Tony Blair in the so-called Board of Peace, which is supposed to oversee the reconstruction of Gaza in later stages of the ceasefire. And this was Trump's remark.
That Tony would be popular with all, because I just don't know that. And I like Tony. I've always liked Tony, but I want to find out that he's an acceptable.
Yeah, so he's kind of walking back the talk of Blair as a kind of neo-colonial governor of Gaza. So he's saying, well, I've got to see if he's acceptable to people in the region. Of course, Blair is wildly unpopular in the region due to his role as a war criminal during the 2003 invasion of Iraq, and as well as his decades of support for Israeli crimes. But, Trump has to deal with these leaders of Qatar, UAE, and other regional vassals. There was another comment he made when he was asked about disagreements over his plan and who will now govern the Gaza Strip.
I wanted to ask you about your conversations with world leaders today. You said that everybody is unified over your plan, but we heard from President Sisi calling for a two-state solution and independent Palestinians.
So you're talking about a different plan. I'm talking about something very much different. We're talking about rebuilding Gaza. I'm not talking about single state or double state or two-state. We're talking about the rebuilding of Gaza.
What's the road ahead for governing
Well,
Gaza?
we're going to have to see. I mean, a lot of people like the one-state solution. Some people like a two-state solution. So we'll have to see. I haven't commented on that.
How do you see bridging that gap? Because you have the Arab countries.
At some point, I'll decide what I think is right, but I'd be in coordination with other states and other countries.
I find that quite interesting. Ali, what did you make of that comment about, well, some people like one state, some people like two state?
It's interesting. He said that at the beginning of his first administration. Remember, there was quite a lot of fanfare about that. And of course, I'm happy to him say that. I mean, he might not mean what I mean by a one-state solution, because we know that, the Zionists want a one-state solution with no Palestinians.
Yeah.
But at the same time, that's going to really upset, these the European Union Zionists who are recognizing the non-existent phantasmic Palestinian state in order to cement the idea of a so-called two-state solution, which they see as the only way to save Israel. But I think once you start talking about a one-state solution, once you allow that discussion to happen, then that doesn't mean it's going to go the way Donald Trump wants it to go. I think what's clear now with the shifts of opinion, the sea change in opinion that we're seeing in the United States and around the world, is that there's no obvious reason why a vast majority of Americans should be committed to a Jewish supremacist ethnocracy. They're going to say, well, yeah, the obvious solution is everyone gets equal rights and the same protections under the law and the same, one person, one vote. That's going to be the logical solution to the vast majority of people. It's only the committed fanatics who believe that Israeli Jews deserve special and better rights than Palestinians who are going to be committed to the Zionist version. So he doesn't want to commit to a two-state solution because his Zionist bankrollers, who we're going to talk about, don't want him to. But at the same time, it opens up the space for us to start to move beyond the fantasy of a two-state solution.
Yeah. Well, there was one more thing that he said on Air Force One that was of particular significance. So even more notable was what he said about Hamas governing Gaza in the interim period. Asked about reports this week that we talked about earlier, that Hamas fighters and Hamas sort of police force have seized the window of opportunity provided by the Israeli withdrawal to fight back against Israel-armed criminal looting gangs that have been starving Palestinians during the Gaza genocide. Trump said the following.
Hamas rearming, instituting themselves as a Palestinian police force, shooting rivals. What is your message to Hamas?
We are standing because they do want to stop the problems, and they've been open about it, and we gave them approval for a period of time.
So, that's significant. He claimed there that, we gave them approval for a period of time to act as a police force. And if he's, it was a little hard to hear over the engine, but what he also said was, well, that it's understandable they want to stop the problems. So it's always a bit hard to tell what Trump is referring to, but he's presumably referring to the looting gangs. Of course, Trump doesn't mention the fact that looting gangs have been systematically armed and given air support by Israel. Now, that, of course, was significant because the 20-point plan that you discussed with Helena earlier, Trump released it last month, and it calls on all Palestinian factions to give up their weapons. However, the agreement that was actually signed last week doesn't mention anything at all about disarmament. So, I don't know. To me, that comment from Trump, it seems to be almost coming off the top of his head. But then again, it also seems to be him simply recognizing the reality of what is happening on the ground. However, it has to be said, a few days after he made that comment on Tuesday this week, after the prisoner exchange had happened, Trump kind of walked it back a bit, and he said that, quote, if they don't disarm, we will disarm them, and that will happen quickly and perhaps violently. So, again, it's the typical thing of Trump of kind of swinging from one extreme to the other.
Yeah, I'm curious to know if John thinks that the United States has the ability to disarm Hamas quickly and perhaps violently.
I do not.
I'm surprised.
I think we have 700 and what day? 734 days of evidence of one of the most brutal military campaigns that anybody can remember. Failed completely and utterly failed. I don't see this disarming track is I think I'm concerned about it because it's not going to happen, and it gives Israel a I
mean, it's Israel, like you said, Ali, it's Israel demanding that Hamas do what it itself has failed to do in not just 2 years, but in decades of the Palestinian resistance movements.
And why should the resistance disarm?
Help the
colonial
genocidal
occupier should disarm. The entity that perpetrates the crime of crimes, genocide, should disarm and be disarmed.
Exactly.
But the whole so-called international community discourse endorsed by the whole West and by the UN Secretary General is that the Palestinians are the problem.
Yeah.
The Palestinians are sick and radical. They need to be de-radicalized because they refuse to live under a brutal colonial system of apartheid that is willing to mass murder them if they don't submit to being non-humans on their own land.
Right.
That's not who needs to be de-radicalized. It's the Israeli public that needs to be de-radicalized, that overwhelmingly supported this genocide and overwhelmingly participated in it. As Haim Rashid Jabna told us, was it 2 weeks ago, this is the most democratic genocide in history because it required mass participation from Israelis, and with few exceptions, they went along with it. There were a few dissenting voices, but very few.
𝐶𝐐 will give in. Sorry, go ahead, Nora.
I was just going to say, just the fact that the Palestinians who have been the recipients of this state violence and this apartheid and 2 years of genocide were expected to negotiate for their own, for the end of their genocide, just at the fundamental level, just the insipid, like, perverse nature of that in itself, let alone now the expectation and the demands by the genocidal perpetrators to give up their arm. I mean, it's I don't know. It just continues to like make me feel like I'm crazy. Like this is no other people, in this current world have had to negotiate the end of their own genocide, and yet here we are. Sorry, John, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that 𝐶𝐐 will give up their weapons to the Palestinian National Army, which they effectively are operating as and have been from Gaza for the past 2 decades. So I think you'll see that in the negotiations that come forward, a principled negotiation by Hamas on behalf of 𝐶𝐶 that says when there is statehood, and not just like Helena said, not just an idea of a state, but a state that has borders and independence and sovereignty, that state's weapons will be 𝐶𝐶's weapons. But until that point,
John, the so-called international community, the countries that rushed forward with their fake recognitions, France, the UK, Canada, those countries, they all said, a demilitarized Palestinian state. So they anticipated that. So they don't even want this imaginary state to be able to defend itself. So they don't want Palestinians to resist. And then when this magical state somehow comes into existence through, I don't know what, asking the Israelis nicely, because that always works, then it won't be able to defend itself either.
Right.
Yeah. Those recognitions were to the right of Netanyahu, pretty much. I mean, from that position to say that the state has to disarm, and the prime minister of this country saying that it had to be a Zionist Palestinian state, a disarmed Zionist Palestinian state. I mean, we covered that well on this show. Those recognitions were an embarrassment to international diplomatic trade craft.
Yeah, I think the Canadian comment was the most telling and most Trump-like, actually. That is what they want, a Zionist Palestinian state.
But that two-state solution is a Zionist solution, because the whole point of it is, Palestinians don't need a little itty-bitty state on a part of Palestine. Palestinians would like to return to and exercise self-determination in all of Palestine, which is their right. The only reason to have a two-state solution, and this is why it was conceived, is so that you can have Jewish supremacy on at least part of Palestine. And the argument between Western liberal Zionists and the Likudnik right wing in the West and in Israel is, what's the best way to save Israel? This is two competing Zionist visions. The Emmanuel Macron, Keir Starmer, Mark Carney vision is, we love Israel so much, the only way to save Israel is to allow a little Palestinian statelet that will keep Israel intact as a Jewish state with a Jewish majority, so that we can pretend it's also a democracy. That's the liberal vision of Zionism. The one that's dominant in the US and in Israel is, no, we don't need to worry about that. We can expel the Palestinians. We can just take their land and make them live either as slaves or expel them. Tell them, you don't want to live here with no rights, then you're welcome to leave. And we're not going to pretend we care about democracy. So it's important to understand that that's why Palestinians aren't allowed to be part of these conversations. That's when Emmanuel Macron and the Saudis convene a so-called conference on the two-state solution. It's without Palestinians, because this isn't about Palestinians. This is about what's the best way to save Israel.
Yeah.
And Palestinians have no interest in that. Their interest is in restoring their rights. And restoring their rights is incompatible with Zionism, which is a racist, supremacist ideology that negates their existence and whose logic is genocide. Because if you say that Israel has a right to exist as a Jewish state, then it logically follows that Israel has a right to eliminate the non-Jewish majority in the country. Otherwise, how else can it be a Jewish state? So the genocide is actually Israel exercising its right to exist as a Jewish state. And if you support Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state, you must support genocide, because there is no other way to assure it in a situation where non-Jews are the majority in Palestine. They were before 1948. There was a period through ethnic cleansing where they became the minority. Now they are the majority again. Nature, natural population growth has restored the situation that existed before 1948. And the only way, in South Africa, you had the same discussion. How can we preserve white supremacy? By retrenching, shrinking the white supremacist state a bit, by giving up the Bantustans, but we'll still maintain white supremacy overall. It's the same thing now, and nobody should be, bamboozled by it.
I think very few people comparatively are at this point after this last 2 years of genocide. I think Israel has shown what it is to the whole world. I think that these kind of conferences are trying to protect that, because they saw the delegitimization of Israel being showing up in every young person around the world and otherwise who they are.
Yeah. I mean, what was that famous quote, Ali? Was it from Arnon Sofer, who said, in order to maintain...
I have that quote, actually. And actually, something Trump sent in his speech, it evoked that. It evoked it. I don't know if he's smart enough to quote it.
It's one of the clearest,
the
clearest descriptions of Zionism. If we want to maintain our Jewish state, we have to kill and kill and kill.
Yeah, I have that clip. So shall we bite the bullet and dive into what Trump said in the Knesset? We saw the clip earlier with Helena where we don't need to play that again, but he started off, he declared the end of the war, and then he spent a long time thanking people in the room, Pete Hegseth, Jared Kushner, Steve Witkoff, all of his people basically who'd helped him negotiate the deal. And he also, the first clip is he lauded his attack on Iran in June, and this was one of the key themes of his speech, I would argue, which was he claimed he had degraded the country's nuclear energy program, and he said the following.
They took a big hit, didn't they? Didn't they take a big hit? Boy, oh boy. They got hit from one side, from the other. And it would be great if we could make a peace deal with them, and I think that's big. Would you be happy with that? Wouldn't it be nice, I think?
And then he said, of course, but first we've got to get Russia done. So he's saying to Witkoff that we've got to go and get a deal with Russia as well. And later in the speech, he also described the JCPOA deal signed with Iran by the Obama administration as a disastrous deal. And he claimed that now Iran wants to make a deal, even if they say they don't. And he said to Iran, we're ready when you are. So there's that.
The world wanted peace and Israel wanted peace. Everybody did. Everybody did. And what a victory it's been, right? What a victory it's been. If you would have gone on for 3-4 more years, keep fighting, it was getting bad. It was getting heated. The timing of this is brilliant. And I said, Bibi, you're going to be remembered for this far more than if you kept this thing going, kill. It would be it would not be the same. And I just want to congratulate you for having the courage to say, that's it, we've won, and now let's enjoy our lives.
So, he's trying to publicly say this is the end of it. And as we saw in the clip earlier, he's even saying it's the end of 3,000 years. Some people say 500 years of war. So he's saying it's the end of it. And yet the reality on the ground, of course, as we've seen, is very different. The kill comment there that we saw, I mean, that really struck me because... So the quote from Arnon Sofer that you mentioned, Nora, Arnon Sofer, for viewers and listeners who don't know, was an important advisor to the Israeli Prime Minister at the time, back in 2004, Ariel Sharon, and it was of the time of the tactical withdrawal of Israeli settlers from within the Gaza Strip. And this was a very similar process to what you mentioned, Ali, of the Bantustans, of the kind of in South Africa, the kind of retrenchment of the white supremacist system in South Africa by strategically withdrawing from the so-called homelands, the so-called Bantu homelands, as the white supremacist regime called it. And this was a kind of similar thing to what the Israelis did. And it was all about engineering Jewish supremacy in Palestine overall. And what Arnon Sofer said to the Jerusalem Post in this infamous quote, which you've quoted in the past quite a few times, Ali, was when 2.5 million. This, and remember, this is him speaking in 2004 when the population was much less than this. When 2.5 million people live in a closed-off Gaza, it's going to be a human catastrophe. Those people will become even bigger animals than they are today. The pressure at the border will be awful. It's going to be a terrible war. So if we want to remain alive, we'll have to kill all day, every day. And of course, that's what they did.
Yeah.
That quote, Asa, and he goes on, and it's just horrible what he says. He says, we have to kill all day, every day. And he says, the only thing I worry about, you have the quote there in front of you, but he says, the only thing I worry about is that the boys who are going to do the killing come back, and are able to live normal lives. It's just something grotesque like that. But I think the significance of this interview by Arnon Sofer, which really laid out the logic of Zionism plainly and without any adornment. But also, I think it tells us that the genocide in Gaza was preordained. It was going to happen. From the Zionist perspective, they had to do it. The question was not if, it was when. It was what would be the right moment. And this is important because you have these revisionist narratives that people are trying to put in place, that the Palestinian resistance is responsible for the genocide, as if you can ever blame a people for their own genocide. An occupied, colonized people is never responsible for the atrocities and crimes of the colonial occupier. Algerians weren't responsible for French savagery. Kenyans weren't responsible for British savagery. Native Americans and indigenous people in Canada were not responsible. There was nothing they did that forced the European colonizers to try to exterminate them. So we mustn't allow people to impose that victim-blaming narrative on Palestinians either, ever. But the point here is that genocide has to be part of the plan if your goal is an ethno-state in a country where the vast majority of people, or the majority of people, are not from the ethnic group that is going to be the privileged class in that state.
I don't have the rest of the article right in front of me, but it was certainly I think you pretty much quoted him more or less verbatim there. He was worried about the mental health, essentially, of Israeli soldiers who were doing the killing. And, you know, he predicted that correctly, because there has reportedly been a kind of mental health crisis amongst Israeli soldiers. Nothing compared to Palestinians in Gaza, of course, but there has been a phenomenon of soldiers being unable to return to re-enlist and return to the battlefield.
Well, it's like Golda Meir saying, you know, I will never forgive the Arabs for making us kill their children, or, you know, something like completely psycho
obscene,
like that. Yeah.
Obscene stuff.
Completely.
Well, Trump concluded his speech by asking President Herzog, Israel, of course, has a kind of European-style president who has some political powers, but less than the prime minister, and that's the President Isaac Herzog, who is a racist in his own right, and of course infamously said there's no such thing as innocent, at the beginning of the genocide, said there's no such thing as uninvolved innocent Palestinians in Gaza, and it's the whole society responsible. And that was actually cited by South Africa in its ICJ case against Israel for genocide. But Trump asked Herzog at the end of his speech to pardon Netanyahu for the corruption charges he's facing. And his final line was, "I love Israel, I'm with you all the way." I'll spare you those clips. But possibly the most revealing part of the speech, which has been talked a lot about on social media, was when he publicly lauded his campaign donor, Miriam Adelson, of course, as well as her late husband, the casino mogul Sheldon Adelson. Now, Miriam Adelson, remember, has donated, last year alone, $100 million to Trump's election campaign, and to the previous two election campaigns before that one. I didn't get the figure for that, but I'm sure it's in the similar sort of ranges, certainly tens of millions of dollars. And that was more last year than Elon Musk, and it was quite similar. The clip I'm about to show you is quite similar, actually, Ali, to that clip we watched earlier, that you played earlier, of Trump saying that the Emirati official Sheikh Mansour had unlimited cash. He's kind of just saying what comes into his head when he sees people. So we're going to play this clip of what he said to Adelson in full, because it's pretty astonishing.
But every president for decades said, we're going to do it. The difference is I kept my promise and officially recognized the capital of Israel and moved the American embassy to Jerusalem. Isn't that right, Miriam? Look at Miriam, she's back there. Stand up, Miriam. Stand up. Miriam and Sheldon would come into the office. They'd call me. He'd call me. I think they had more trips to the White House than anybody else I can think of. Look at her sitting there so innocently. She's got $60 billion in the bank. $60 billion. And I think she's saying no more. And she loves Israel, but she loves it, and they would come in, and her husband was a very aggressive man, but I loved him. He was a very aggressive, very supportive of me. And he'd call up, can I come over and see you? I say, Sheldon, I'm the president of the United States. It doesn't work that way. He'd come in, we would do. But they were very responsible for so much, including getting me thinking about Golan Heights, which is probably one of the greatest things to ever happen to Israel. Miriam, stand up, please. She really is. I mean, she loves this country. She loves this country. Her and her husband are so incredible. We miss him so dearly. But I actually asked her, I'm going to get her in trouble with this, but I actually asked her once, I said, so Miriam, I know you love Israel. What do you love more, the United States or Israel? She refused to answer. That might mean Israel, I must say. We love you. Thank you, darling, for being here. That's a great honor. Great honor. She's a wonderful woman. She is a great woman. I've always stood for the people of this community, and I always will. I'll always be with you. I'm always going to be with you. I guess maybe something could happen to change my mind. Somebody that's really stupid gets into office and wants to do really bad things, but that's about it. We don't think we're going to have that happen. I hope we're not going to have that happen. And this man is a good man right here. These two men are good men right here.
Oh my God, make it stop. $60 billion, and she like doesn't have the right, hairstyling creams, or I mean, she's like not using any moisturizer. Like, I don't. Sorry, it's petty.
I can't help but laughing because everyone looks so uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Didn't they? Like, Miriam Adelson is going, sit down, stop making a fuss. But at the same time, she's trying to just grin through it.
She's putting it all out there. I mean, that was the Make America Great Again, America First president, just telling us all openly, well, what we already knew, but it's coming from the horse's mouth, that the top financiers of his campaign, the top Israel lobbyists in the world, could effectively march into the White House anytime they wanted and dictate his policy. That's exactly what he just said. He wasn't even thinking about the Golan Heights.
He'd never heard of it.
They made him think about it, and then he gave it.
No, that's a good point, John. Like, he said, oh yeah, it got me thinking about the Golan Heights for the first time. But Nora, you've just pointed out her dress had custom yellow ribbons on it. I didn't notice that.
Tamara pointed that out. I didn't even notice. Okay. I could hardly look at her. Like, it's just,
I'm sure.
I'm sure it did.
Hideous.
But like, it's I don't know. I could probably write an article about that clip, to be honest. But no, I mean, it's like you said. He's boasting of how the sausage is made. Like, this is how
the veneers are gone.
Like he just, which is why everyone seems to look that everyone's smiling through it, but they seem to look a bit uncomfortable that he's just saying it. I mean, what is more to say, really? He's just saying it there. And also he accuses her not only of being I was kind of flabbergasted when I saw it, because it was, even for Trump, it was pretty frank. I mean, he accused her of being Israel first as well, or Israel only.
Yeah, it wasn't even dual loyalty. It was like singular loyalty.
And how does that play with his base? I mean, will they see that? What will they think? I mean, already on the right, there is this opening of unprecedented opening of space to criticize Israel. And it really comes from this notion that Israel has too much influence in the United States. It's not based on solidarity with the Palestinians as such, although there is some of that. Some right-wing people have spoken with empathy for Palestinians, but a lot of it is sort of motivated by this idea that our politicians are controlled by various interests and lobbies, not least of them the Israel lobby. And it seems he's only fueling that criticism, perhaps deliberately. Who knows? Maybe
I wonder how calculated some of this is.
The other thing, Asa, that you mentioned regarding Trump calling on President Isaac Herzog, the president of Israel, to pardon Netanyahu. I mean, on its face, that just seems so crass. Like, why would he want that? But Max Blumenthal actually commented on this in a way that made me think. It's like, that might be the only way to make sure that Israel doesn't go back to war, because as long as Netanyahu has these corruption charges hanging over him, then he has to stay in office forever. And then he has to keep wars going forever. So maybe that's like a harm reduction measure, pardoning him for these corruption charges and getting him out of office. That might be the only way to get him to agree to leave office. But then, of course, he will be a private individual, and he needs to be arrested and taken to The Hague or to any other country that puts him on trial for genocide under universal jurisdiction.
Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty astonishing stuff. Well, I mean, I think maybe the last thing to say on the Adelsons is just that if you want to read more about Sheldon and Miriam Adelson, I wrote an article about the pro-Israel empire of Sheldon Adelson soon after he passed away in 2021, and how it was being handed over to via, you know, this sort of complicated series of family trusts and whatnot to Miriam Adelson, who I haven't seen the more recent figures, but at the time was said to be by far the richest person in Israel. So, and he was, of course, a casino billionaire who made his money in Las Vegas, owned several newspapers and whatnot, and Miriam Adelson now owns all of that and continues the same sort of malign influence campaign now.
Worst people on earth. Thanks for that, Asa. Let's take a look at the website.
One more
ahead.
thing.
Yes.
Can we do one more very quick thing?
Yes.
And that's just this clip.
Yeah.
Yeah, I almost forgot, but I want to show it. It's very quick. This clip of the press briefing at the European Union in Brussels. Let's run it.
In repeating several times that Russia should repay for the reconstruction of Ukraine, do you believe Israel should repay for the reconstruction of Gaza, since they have destroyed almost all the strip and the civilian infrastructures? Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriele. It's definitely an interesting question on which I would not have any comment at this stage.
Yeah, she's waiting to get her marching orders, essentially. It seems like. I mean, Trump did mention reconstruction of Gaza in his speech in the Knesset, and he said it's going to be good for Israel too, BB.
Yeah. But they're just like the sheer, you know, I think...
shock. They've never even thought about it.
Well, it just like there's no pretense anymore that their policy is driven by any kind of principles. You know, the EU that held itself up as the world's repository of values. It's just so clear. As Helena Cobban said, they're so eager to return to business as usual and whitewash Israel and shield it from the consequences. You know, they're talking about confiscating Russian assets that were held in European banks, and this might include private assets, in order to give restitution to Ukraine. And they haven't even thought about whether Israel should repay for the destruction that it has caused as part of a genocide. It's just so disgusting.
Someone in the comments said, more like a suppository of values. All right. Thank you for that. Definitely we'll watch how they try and squirrel their way out of that argument over and over again. Let's take a look at the website. We have some fantastic new pieces by our staff writers. That's Dave Cronin's new piece, Ireland Must Not Be Intimidated by Britain's Stance on Palestine. Thank you, Dave, for tracking European developments so diligently, as always. Give that a read. We have some analysis features. Of course, Maureen Claire Murphy, our senior editor, puts together the monthly roundup of photographs from Palestine, Palestinian pictures.
It's so much more than the photos are extraordinary. You can see that first one there capturing the moment of Israel destroying a high-rise building in Gaza in the latter part of the genocide that was earlier in September. And all these photos, pretty much all of them, are by Palestinian photographers who have continued working throughout this genocide. And then Maureen does this extraordinary, factual, very precise roundup of what has happened over the past month. It's sort of similar to your news briefing, Nora, but it covers the whole month. And so this is really a vital resource. When I read this is how I keep up on so much of the development. So I can't recommend this enough.
Yeah. no, it's just extraordinary. It's a document in so many ways. And I mean, even just, like those photographs that were taken in September feel like years ago sometimes. I mean, just all the developments that happen on an hour-to-hour basis. It's so important to go back and remember what has happened just a few weeks ago, to have a whole the holistic context of what Palestinians are experiencing right now, and it's not divorced from any historical moment, either from recent history or from 80 years ago. So it's brilliant, and I'm always so grateful for Maureen for putting that together every month. And we have some features and analysis. As always, just go to the electronicintifada.net website, look at our new features and our news reports. We have, as always, just incredible material, especially from our writers in Gaza who are putting their lives back together as best they can. Hit the Get Updates link to sign up for our email list. And on the other side of the page, the Donate Now link to keep this engine going, to keep this publishing. And Ali, did you want to thank some of our donors for this week?
Yes, I want to thank everyone, not just our donors, for all their support, sharing, first of all, being here, reading, sharing, watching, helping us to get the word out. Our goal, our sole mission is to provide people with good information and analysis about Palestine. It is free for everyone in the world. There's never a paywall. There is never, we don't ask people to subscribe in order to read or watch or listen to this material. It's there for everyone forever. So we're very grateful to everyone who helps spread this information and uses it in their activism. We hear that all the time, people telling us that they've used information that we've published, reports we've done, as a way to educate people in campaigns they're doing. And that is always tremendously satisfying whenever people tell us they're doing that. And of course, we can only do this work with the support of our viewers, readers, and listeners who make it possible through their donations. And of course, we only want those who are able to contribute to do so. We don't want anyone to experience hardship because of their contribution. So if you can, please do, because you're helping to make this available for everyone, including those who can't afford to make a contribution, who aren't in a position to do so. So it's also an act of solidarity when you make a contribution, because you're helping us share this with everyone. And we're particularly grateful to people who've signed up to give a monthly donation, which is an easier way to give over time and to give more over time and perhaps not feel the pinch so much. So if you can do that, you can also do that when you click on Donate Now. And I'll just mention a few people who have given gifts recently, and we're grateful to each and every person who has. And I'm just going to name a few as sort of a representative of the wider group. So Luigina, Maria, Christina, Daniel, John, David, Ashley, Deborah, Aubrey, Gregory, Eric, Sierra, Joseph, Sadiq, Khadija, Pete, Marina, and Omar. Thank you all so much for your support.
Thank you. Thank you all. And of course, a big, huge thanks to Tamara Nassar behind the scenes for directing and producing this live stream and everything else that she does. Ellie Gerzon for social media production. Pierre Loisel for putting this together as a radio package. Michael F. Brown for fact checking. Everyone at the Electronic Intifada. And on behalf of myself, Ali, Jon, Asa, and Tamara, thank you all, and we will see you next week.